Recording in progress.
Welcome to the Promethean channel. We see Dan and Scott have. Is that a 3D
Multiple
printed pipe?
pipes? What?
The one on
Where?
the,
Authentic.
the
Real
not the
pipe.
space, that one, yeah.
Real pipes. This is real briar.
Oh, I
From,
couldn't see it, just kind of 3D
You say
printed from where I
from the
was.
European
this
briar
is
woods.
this is real 3D.
The woods of briar. This is my space pipe. If we ever make a sci-fi movie, I will be Captain Spaceman. And I will.
Spaceman, yeah.
Wait, isn't that Spaceman from 30 Rock? Spaceman.
Dr. Space.
Dr. Spaceman. We have no idea what we're talking about today.
Well,
Best
Rory
artist
suggested
comic
talking
books.
about our.
Past 40 years.
What was that, Dan?
What?
The best comic book artists for the past 40 years.
Adi Agrov.
I don't know that many artists.
Avi Avrov. What's his name?
I mean,
What's his name?
Jack Kirby?
Abercrombie.
That's about where I stop.
I know
on
how
the
to pronounce
knowledge.
Jack Kirby.
Jack Kirby's a good choice.
Adi
Good
Avrov.
choice.
Grov. What is
Steve
his
Ditko?
name?
The guy that did your Iron Man covers that you love so much.
Yeah, Bob Layton.
Look it up.
Bob Layton. Love it. I love
That's
Bob.
not even close to Abby.
He was the inspiration for the movie Iron Man.
goodness.
You've heard of it with Rodney?
Was he the original Iron Man?
Downey Dooner? What's that, Murray? Oh my God, Downey Dooner.
Wow, this is awful. Okay, so Dan's gonna share some wisdom about who he thinks are top artists.
Dan is the only one among.
That's not true.
No, wait.
You all,
No.
everyone can have an opinion
No,
about
I know.
art.
Shush
It's
him.
subjective.
Did you
That's
shush
the whole
him?
point of art.
Dan is the only one amongst us with the bona fides and the
That's
chops
It's not true.
to talk about art.
True.
I,
It's not true.
It's
That's
subjective.
very
Art
true.
is subjective. Anyone can have an opinion about art.
okay.
But your opinion could be
It
wrong.
might be, you can have that opinion.
Okay. I know what I like.
But we don't necessarily know who the artists are.
yeah,
It's
Dan,
true.
But you yeah.
Post
You can have a whole bunch of wrong artists.
Post 2000, I'm clueless. People can comment all they want in the comment section about who they think is great. But I mean, for me, the greatest comic artist of all time is probably John Byrne. I think.
John Byrne.
Yes, B-Y-R-E.
Who's that?
You don't know
What
who
did he
John
do?
Byrne is?
I don't know who that is.
No.
Give me some examples.
He did like a 5-year run on Fantastic Four. He did Alpha Flight. He did Superman when they rebooted it at DC. He did X-Men for Dark Horse Comics.
But what did he do?
He was like in the 80s, which is like my wheelhouse. Like he was my guy. He was the guy I wanted to draw like. He was the guy I wanted to emulate. He was a comic artist and writer, and he kind of did everything. He inked his own stuff for a while too. On X-Men, I think he might have lettered his own stuff. The only thing he didn't do was color it. And X-Men was like colored by Matt Webb. I think you can check.
Okay, yeah,
on
that answered my question.
I'm not sure.
You say these
but,
things, and I don't.
A lot of people like he could churn out work too. Like he could churn out like 3 pages a day. He was consistent. He would
Wow.
write ink, pencil work on like a 3-page a day.
Dang.
Good luck finding that today.
Phenomenal. People like, I think when I worked at Marvel in the mid 90s, like people would like harass me about him not being like the greatest. They would like mention people like Michael Golden, who's a phenomenal artist and probably like from a draftsmanship and like technical standpoint, much better than John Byrne, but he did not produce the volume of work John Byrne did in like the 80s and early 90s.
So would you say he was really good and like voluminous? Like he
Yes,
had
like
a
he-
lot
like
of
he was-
material.
He would write and draw 2 books a month consistently through the 80s and early 90s. Like he was amazing. Like just for the volume of work he could produce at a high level. And like he was the dude that like got me into X-Men, got me into Alpha Flight, got me into all these books. And it was just like what he produced. Like he worked with Claremont on the early X-Men books, but then left X-Men to work on Fantastic Four for 5 years, a run from issue 232 to 292, where he just penciled and wrote every issue, and it was a phenomenal run. Like many people, I think if they would go back and really look at it, was one of the seminal runs of like comic book.
So how I have a question. How does that work? How do you like work on something for so long? You work on one comic for 5 years and you're super successful. Everyone loves it. And somebody else comes along, hey, can you work on my comic over here? You're like, yeah, sure. I'm just gonna pivot totally and stop working on
I
something.
was at Marvel in the mid '90s, so like I was as an assistant editor. So I like from the other side of things. Sometimes when an editor would take over a new book, they would kind of look at it and be like, "Well, I want to put my stamp on it. So I want my writer, I want
Sure,
my artist on it." So like sometimes, like when an editor would take over a series, they would want a whole new creative team involved with it, so they could put their stamp on it. I'm not sure what the deal was with. I think Byrne at the end of the Fantastic Four run was kind of. It's been 5 years, like 60 issues, where he was writing and just telling these stories that were remarkable, like really, really good stories. Like if you go back and read them, and I think maybe he had had enough and he was ready to move on to something else. And then I think after Fantastic Four was maybe Hulk. I'm not sure what he did after Fantastic Four exactly, and then like Alpha Flight was in the mix too somewhere.
So he just wanted something different.
He did a lot of different stuff
Yeah.
for Marvel. Yeah, he was doing a lot of work, and then he went over to DC and did revamped Superman after the Crisis on Infinite Earths. I mean, that was '86, I think.
See, this is what I'm talking about. He just talked and said lots of things that
Really
he
interesting things.
clearly knows about.
Lots of things
And-
about John Byrne.
and I don't-
Byrne is like my favorite.
I don't know. See, I see some guys that I like.
Mhm.
Like Rory, I mentioned Alex Ross, right? He's his stuff. He's the hyper realistic, really good. He did Marvels.
Marvels was
That
the
was-
first thing,
that
and then
was-
he did
Mhm.
DC Kingdom Come.
Yeah.
was after that.
His art. He can't produce fast enough to do sequential. He can't.
No, not
Like,
not
he's
not on
full
a
on.
regular basis.
He's like
yeah.
cover art.
Movie poster.
Yeah. And so then I love style wise, I love the Bob Layton. I say that, and I met him. Really nice guy. He's one of the few people in the comic book industry I've met. But his Iron Man, his '80s Iron Man, is classic comic book art, and it's good. I love him. That's like my Iron Man with the big arm things and the boot things and the
Technical
not this guy.
expertise.
No.
Technical expertise there.
I that then and classic comic. So I have like degrees of like Kirby, and we were talking about the 30s Superman. That
Yeah, if you go way back, it's just like the kind of the evolution of the art over time. It's like you can look back on like someone like Siegel and Schuster or a Kurt Swan and these guys that did it in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and like that you can see what the groundwork they're laying. But like then you get to like the 60s and you get guys like Neil Adams and you get guys like Byrne was like 70s and stuff, but you have John Buscema. You get these guys that are really phenomenal craftsmen.
Who's the Tarzan guy? The Conan.
Frazetta.
Frazetta.
Who did the covers? Yeah,
Yes.
he didn't ever do really comic book work, but yeah.
I love that.
Or like if you want to go, Bernie Wrightson, it's like the comic guy that did like Swamp Thing and a lot of horror comics in the '60s and early '70s. And he's like phenomenal. But it's interesting to follow. I don't know what we're talking about here, but it's like the graduation, the evolution of like comic art. Oh, we lost Rory.
Yeah, we lost.
We lost
Over
Rory.
time.
He'll be back.
Here, Rory.
So I try to look it up, and I can't quite find who I dislike. So Adi Granoff, right?
That's the right.
Adi
Yes.
Granoff, and that's early 2000s. Just because he was the inspiration for the style for the Iron Man movies. That was the Extremis run.
Oh yeah.
In the comic book, and it's different than the movies, but it was really
Sure.
He did the whole book, and the art is incredible. And it was like only 6 or 9 issues where he did the whole thing. I don't know if Rory's here.
He did covers, right?
No,
I read
he did.
I read those.
The whole book.
So.
There were a whole. It's only a few. It's only like 6 or 9
That's
issues.
kind of getting past mine.
It was early 2000 because I remember it's when I lived in Hawaii. So 2004, 5, 6.
Oddly, like 96 to 98 is when I worked at Marvel, and after that, it's like
He
when I
gave up,
kind of
yeah.
got out of comics. Interestingly enough.
But that was the same era that they rebooted Iron Man twice in 1 year, and then for a while they went into that anime style where what's this muscle here? Your delta
Trapezius.
your trap that like they had like huge traps and their arms were like really long. You know what I'm talking about, right? They were very
That's
jacked.
not anime style at all. But anyways,
I don't know what it was well kind of a
cartoonish.
cartoonish Japanese style. Like their arms are longer. I don't know how you I don't know how to explain it because I don't know the terminology.
Yeah, I don't
Didn't
know.
like it. Iron Man's my guy, so he got a little silly, and I gave up for a while. But I love just the classic comic book art. And I didn't pay attention to who was drawing much when I
just
was a
knew
kid.
what you
I
liked
just
to
knew what I
see.
liked.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's interesting because like that's kind of like I don't know, but by the time I was like 12 or 13, I knew I really liked John Byrne's work.
Yeah.
And I would like buy anything he did depending on what he was working on. Frank Miller was kind of the same. His stuff was amazing. He did Daredevil and then went over to Marvel. And like I think Jim Shooter alienated a lot of guys in the mid 80s, and that's when Byrne and Miller, all these guys went over to DC and did Dark Knight, and Byrne did Superman and revamped all of them after Crisis on Infinite Earths, that series. But it was just kind of like this whole renaissance where I was like really into Marvel, and all these guys went to DC, and I started to read DC stuff. I got into all this stuff over there that was kind of foreign to me at the time, but it was cool because these creators I liked were doing that work. So sometimes creators can mean a lot to a series and what you're into and what
Certainly.
you're following.
Yeah, because it was the art for a while, Iron Man, that turned me off. And also I feel like they jumped the shark with Iron Man, and I feel like they did it in the movies too, where his suit could do everything with the nano things and like.
Yeah, I mean, even from like if you're talking from like a perspective of what was popular at the time in the 80s and early 90s, it was definitely art. It's like Image was pretty much founded on the fact that all these artists wanted to have complete creative control over stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when Image started, and you had Todd McFarlane and Eric Larson and Rob Liefeld and all these guys starting Spawn and Savage Dragon and Youngblood and Jim Lee and Wildcats and all this stuff. And so there was like these writers being like, well, we're the most important thing. So people are more drawn to the visual.
Right.
So they started their own brand, and like I think some of them found out they weren't quite good at writing or creating, and then they brought some people in. But like someone like Eric Larson actually, but not like interestingly, ended up I think being the most grounded and creative writer artist of the whole group of them that could really produce both. And then you get to the early 2000s, you get people like Brian Michael Bendis, and all of a sudden it becomes like a medium that's dominated by writers. You know, Brian Michael Bendis, Ed Brubaker, and all these guys. People are gravitating more towards writers than artists. So I'm fascinated by like how that change happened and when it happened. I'm not even really sure.
I think it kind of happened in the later 2000s, I think.
Yeah, even like the
It was
early
like-
2000s, really.
Early 2000s, later 2000s. I think you started to see some of the burnout, especially from the Image comics. Not some of it was good, but a lot of it was just like, well, the art's really great. I don't understand or I don't care about these characters or anything like that. It looks
I
cool
think,
though.
like, some of it even has to. I think Marvel and DC were bringing in people like John Michael Straczynski from Babylon 5, and he started to write. I think it was Spider-Man. I'm not even sure 100%. People can call me out on it, but then you know, all these writers from outside of comics started to come in and start writing, and people started to get more involved in the writing aspect of it and being more gravitating towards the writer and what the writers were creating than the art. Whereas I think in the late 80s and early 90s, it was much more dominated by
Yeah.
the artists and what the artists were doing.
And see, and you speak with wisdom and experience, and I didn't pay attention enough to know.
Well, even like
what I
Joss
liked.
Whedon from Buffy, who
Yeah.
then went on to direct Avengers, wrote X-Men in the early 2000s, and it was just like they were bringing in these people from
These
outside
writers,
of comics.
Yeah.
to
And
write
they
create
let them do
books.
and then they let them do, because I know like Joss Whedon had his own comic run. I think it was called The Runaways. That was his within the Marvel universe, but it was his characters, his story, and so you kind of get to see people kind of bringing in writers bringing in their stories into these comic book worlds, and I think it was probably a reaction. People can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but kind of a reaction to the downturn of comics in the 90s and early 2000s as those kind of struggled. They started bringing in bigger names from like television. It's like, oh, well, let's have Joss Whedon write a book, right? Let's have, you know, these people who are like show running these very popular shows. Let's bring them in and see if they can do something cool. But they're obviously not artists, but they got the name behind it. So then it kind of
Yeah,
switches from
that might have even started in the late '90s when I was at Marvel, and Marvel Knights started to be a thing, and they brought in Joe Quesada to kind of run a whole sub imprint of Marvel that was kind of like its own thing. And I think they had Daredevil and a Punisher and maybe a couple other things, and they kind of had like carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. If they wanted to make them more mature, they could do whatever they wanted, and that kind of rubbed a couple of editors the wrong way, especially if their books were being taken away and given to that group. But I think in the long run, it probably ended up being beneficial for the industry because they found they could do more mature stories and do different things. But I mean, that started way back in the '80s with Watchmen, with Dark Knight, and all that stuff. Really,
well, Alan Moore and his stuff,
Sandman, Neil Gaiman, and Alan Moore, and then Marvel finally kind of I think caught up in the later '90s and like let's do more mature stories with some of these established characters. See,
it's like Dark Knight and Frank Miller's stuff. Yeah.
So what's more important? The writer?
This is how we're going to end it. What's more important?
What's more important? The writer or the artist? Rory? Yeah, Rory? Hey, Rory, you got any thoughts?
Rory!
Rory had disappeared about 5 minutes ago. We just kept talking.
His internet conked out. We gotta message from him.
I honestly don't know because you could have amazing visuals, but if you don't have a great story to back it up, it doesn't really matter. But if you don't have a great story to back up, you know, like
you got monkey arms.
Yeah,
I think you kind of need both. I kind of feel like I'd like to have a balance.
Yes, I don't think it's either one. As a writer, I want to say, oh yeah, it's all story. But when you slap on garbage art, no one's going to look at it.
Yeah.
But I will even in any visual media, movies, stage.
I mean, I think Image is kind of like the encapsulation of that. Yeah. Like I was super excited about all the Image stuff, and then I started to read some of it, and I was like, this stuff isn't great because they don't know how to write a comic. But it looked awesome, and I like to look at it, but I didn't like to read it.
There's I've only seen bits of it. The new Francis Ford Coppola movie, like what's it called? It's some future movie.
I'm sorry.
It's supposed to be visually stunning, but people are saying it's kind of the plot's a little lacking. I don't know. I haven't seen it, but yeah, when you can mash up both, like I was starting to say, any visual media, when it's visually stunning, and then when you had a good plot, man, because
don't run.
When you can let the visuals, move you, and then have a great story. And I know that sounds like a duh statement, like
Megalopolis.
Megalopolis.
Sorry, I was looking it up. People.
When you can, it sounds like duh, of course. But yeah, if you can get those two together, man, you just.
Which I think is like what makes like writers and artists that can do both, like a John Byrne, Frank Miller, Mike Mignola, Walt Simonson, these guys that can write their own stories and are really, really good at it, and then couple it with like the ability to just draw phenomenal visuals. It really makes it amazing. But then like or you can couple two people like a Stan and a Jack Kirby, and like what they managed to create in the beginning of the Marvel Universe is pretty phenomenal. And I think either of them could have done it alone. Stan certainly couldn't have done it alone. And Jack Kirby, when he went over to DC and did a bunch of stuff on his own, it was wildly imaginative stuff, like the New Gods and all that stuff. But the stories just weren't really awesome, so they kind of needed each other, and you can kind of see that in like what they were creating. But it's like you can either do it all by yourself. Some people love to work in a vacuum. Some people love synergy. I'm personally a guy that loves, the fact that I can work with somebody else in one, like Ryan Gutierrez, who's the artist on File 13, and like that idea that 1+1=3 is really apparent in that stuff because he brings so much to the table with his visuals and just makes me want to do so much more with the story.
So, what the takeaway from that is, if you're a writer, find an artist that you really enjoyed their work. Don't just settle for okay or whatever, but like make sure that you're passionate and that you enjoy what they create. Because it's the story, right? And the story is going to succeed or fall flat if that art's not where you want it to be. And conversely, artists, make sure you pick up stories. You can be picky. You can afford to be a little picky with your story.
Have a sounding board, like someone you can bounce the idea off of, who's going to be honest with you and say, like, this isn't really great, but if you do this, this, and this, it's going to be better. Like someone you can really trust, who's going to tell you the truth about your story.
And my limited experience as a writers, when you find a good artist, listen to them, because they have a visual mind, and this is in the comic book world, is a visual art. You got your story, but there are so many times that I've had an artist say, if we just did this, oh man, yeah, that's so much better. So the collaborative effort I really enjoy, especially.
Like Ryan on File 13 is just drawing random background characters that I just love the visual so much. I'm like, I'm going to make this person more prominent in the future and use them again, just because the visual is so interesting.
Yeah. So, and with that is all the time we have. Remember to like, share, and subscribe this video. Do all the buttons. Check us out on Facebook. We're launching Patreon. So check us out there. And we will be having a Kickstarter campaign starting very soon. Soon.
Live 365, we got a radio show. It's about nothing right now. I think we have about like 58 songs loaded up, but we're working on it. So I'm really selling it. We're going to have a radio show going soon.
To ask where Rory is.
Yeah, where the heck is Rory? Rory!
And all of those will be in the links in the description below. So thanks, guys, and have a great one.
Yeah, bye.
You too.
Bye.
Recording stopped.